ASEAN. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, was born out of a necessity to bring young, independent nation-states and people into a community with one vision. A look at Southeast Asia in 1967 helps to understand such a goal. The three main building blocks of social identity, ethnicity, religion, and nationalism, are characterized by immense diversity. This diversity is related to its position as a focus of converging land and sea routes. And in addition to the enormous diversity across the countries, nearly every country is a mosaic of peoples with different languages, religions, and identities. Southeast Asia has more than 700 ethnic groups living together. The Philippines, for instance, counts 68 different ethnic groups, while Myanmar includes 135, and Indonesia over 300. Thousands of languages are still spoken, even if at the time of independence national languages were selected. Indonesia, for instance, with more than 300 different native languages, decided to adopt Bahasa Indonesia in 1945. ASEAN is also characterized by a great diversity of religious beliefs and practices. Buddhism is practiced by 33%, with majorities in Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. Islam is the religion of 45% of Southeast Asians, with majorities in Brunei, Indonesia, and Malaysia, as well as South Thailand and the southern Philippines. There is also Christianity, with Catholicism being the main religion of the Philippines, Hinduism, and animism. Confucianism is also found within Chinese communities. The colonial years in Southeast Asia added another layer of diversity, with different colonial experiences and heritage. If Southeast Asian states share some common cultural heritage that dates to the pre-colonial era, colonial rule introduced concepts such as exclusive national identity and national sovereignty. Well-defined political boundaries were built. These clearly delineated political entities masked the numerous internal differences and diversity that runs deep beneath the surface, but also compartmentalized each country, without much knowledge of the other. At the time of the establishment of ASEAN, Southeast Asia was composed of newly independent states, with the exception of Thailand, which was not colonized. Indonesia gained its independence from the Netherlands on August 17, 1945, and the Philippines from the United States on July 4, 1946. Malaysia and Singapore gained independence from the United Kingdom on September 16, 1963, before Singapore was expulsed from the Federation of Malaysia on August 9, 1965. An independent region doesn't automatically mean a peaceful one. From 1961 onwards, Indonesia decided to use force to block independent Malaysia's inclusion of the British Empire territories of Sabah and Sarawak on the island of Borneo. The Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation, also known as Konfrontasi, was a violent conflict. Simultaneously, the Philippines claimed eastern North Borneo, arguing that the Borneo colony had historical links with the Philippines through the Sulu archipelago. Coinciding with Sukarno announcing a year of dangerous living and the 1964 race riots in Singapore, Indonesia launched an expanded campaign of operations into West Malaysia in August 1964, and on January 7, 1965, President Sukarno announced the withdrawal from the United Nations. It was only after Suharto's coup d'etat in September 1965 that a new round of peace negotiations began in May 1966, and a final peace agreement between Indonesia and Malaysia was signed on August 11, 1966, with Indonesia formally recognizing Malaysia. Two previous regional groupings, the Association of Southeast Asia, or ASA, established in 1961, and Malfelindo, for Malaysia, Philippines, and Indonesia, established in 1963 with the project of forming a Greater Malaysian Confederation, didn't resist the confrontasi tensions. The region was not only weakened by domestic and regional tensions, it was also torn apart by external ideological conflicts. Containing the influence of communism drove the engagement of the United States in Southeast Asia, as it did elsewhere, while from the late 1940s and early 50s, China and the USSR supported communist parties all over the region. In September 1954, the establishment of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization was signed with the Manila Pact, a defense agreement designed to counter further communist activity in the region. The concern was still very prevalent for each founding state, while tensions in nearby Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were reaching a new level. The Sino-Soviet split between 1956 and 1966 added more confusion, as Beijing decided to launch its own revolutionary activities in Southeast Asia. So the main question is, why, in such a context, did 5 states of Southeast Asia decide to establish a new regional association? What were they looking for when the 5 foreign ministers of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand met on August 8, 1967 in Bangkok to sign the declaration? The Bangkok Declaration, establishing the association, is a short, simply worded document containing just 5 articles. The aims and purposes it sets out are specifically to accelerate economic growth, social progress, and cultural development through joint endeavors in a spirit of equality and partnership, to promote regional peace and stability, to promote active collaboration and mutual assistance on matters of common interest, to provide assistance to each other, to collaborate more effectively in the greater utilization of agriculture and industries and the expansion of trade, to promote Southeast Asian studies, and to maintain close and beneficial cooperation with existing international and regional organizations. It also established an annual meeting for foreign ministers, a standing committee, ad hoc and permanent committees, and a national secretariat in each member country. The association is open for participation to all states in Southeast Asia that subscribe to the Bangkok Declaration's aims, principles, and purposes. As such, Brunei was admitted in 1984, Vietnam in 1995, Laos and Myanmar in 1997, and Cambodia in 1999. And today, 650 million people live in the territory that constitutes ASEAN. The common goal behind these purposes is to reinforce newly independent states, to strengthen their roots as nation-states. It is to impede disintegrating forces, either ideological or religious, from weakening or slowing down the process. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, was framed as an additional vector for national integration. It was dictated by the domestic imperatives of state building. Political instability was considered the main threat to internal security. Ethnic secessionist groups and communist insurgents were deemed to be the enemies of the state. It is also conceived as an instrument to favor economic development and support the fight against poverty. Last but not least, ASEAN should be a springboard to reinforce their position on the global stage. Southeast Asian states are stronger together than alone.
ASEAN was created in 1967 by 5 countries: Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Singapore. And it was created really as a non-aggression pact between those 5 countries. The reason for this is that between 1963 and 1966, 4 of those 5 countries were involved in something called the confrontasi or confrontation. And this was something initiated by Indonesia in 1963 against Malaysia. Indonesia was trying to destabilize the new state of Malaysia, and then later Singapore too, after it was ejected from Malaysia in 1965. The Philippines got involved because it had territorial conflicts with Malaysia. And so these 4 countries were involved in this low-level conflict, which was damaging to all of them. The confrontasi ended in 1966 when President Suharto of Indonesia was deposed by the Indonesian military. And in 1967, ASEAN was created as a kind of response to this situation, this earlier situation. It was an effort by the regional states to simply assure each other that they were no longer going to interfere in one another's affairs. Now, to make more sense of this, you have to understand that all of these countries, to differing degrees, were involved at the time in the process of state building. They were trying to make a coherent national identity out of many disparate communities, religions, language groups within their own borders. And at the same time, they were all also concerned with the threat of communist insurgency. And so by agreeing not to interfere in one another's affairs, they at least took each other off of the table as potential threats. So that's where ASEAN started. And then later on, it evolved into something more substantial. But nonetheless, that concern with protecting national sovereignty and agreeing not to interfere in one another's affairs in order to create that breathing room, that remains a significant preoccupation with the member states.
In its early years, ASEAN was not activated much outside of the yearly meetings of the 5 foreign ministers, wherein, in 1971, they signed the Declaration of Zophan, establishing a zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality in Southeast Asia, an act of faith considering the context. All 5 member states continued their economic, social, and political developments, considered as imperative for national stability, which could only be achieved when ASEAN maintained its unifying force of stability. But the fall of Saigon, the victory of the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and of the Communist Party in Laos during the spring of 1975 were major changes for the region. The leaders of the 5 founding nations feared that these communist victories would provide ideological support and arms to indigenous communist movements. In this context of emergency, ASEAN began to act as a united front. As a symbol of crucial importance, the 5 heads of state, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines, Datung Hussein of Malaysia, Suharto, the President of Indonesia, and Kukrit Pramoy, the Prime Minister of Thailand, met for the first ASEAN Summit on February 24, 1976, in Bali. There, they adopted the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, or TAC, and signed the Declaration of ASEAN Concord. These are indeed defining documents as they set forth the so-called ASEAN spirit. To maintain a delicate peace, ASEAN states have adopted the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other members, an issue that has come under frequent criticism. Indeed, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in Southeast Asia provided a code of conduct in a legally binding form by stipulating 6 principles: mutual respect for the independence, sovereignty, equality, territorial integrity, and national identity of all nations, the right of every state to lead its national existence free from external interference, subversion, or coercion, non-interference in the internal affairs of one another, settlement of differences or disputes in a peaceful manner, renunciation of the threat or use of violence, and effective cooperation among themselves. Lined out in ASEAN's founding document, the principle of non-interference is the basic principle of ASEAN. It prevents member states from intervening in internal conflicts in other member states. It reconfirms that ASEAN, as a regional grouping, is vigorously espoused to the principle of national sovereignty and non-intervention. What is said implicitly is that the rationale for regional cooperation is the goal of strengthening the capacities of member states. The TAC and the Bali Concord provided a code of conduct, consultation mechanisms, and regional scope for member states to promote peace and stability by enhancing regional resilience. Regional resilience shall be achieved by cooperating in all fields based on the principles of self-confidence, self-reliance, mutual respect, cooperation, and solidarity.
The Treaty of Amity and Cooperation is an important milestone document of ASEAN reflecting the institutional development of the rule of law. It was designed to govern fraught intra-ASEAN relations during the Cold War and signed in 1976, some 9 years after the creation of ASEAN. The TAC's principles of renunciation of the threat of or of the use of force, non-interference in internal affairs, and the peaceful settlement of disputes is critical for many newly emerging states in Southeast Asia coming out of the theaters of proxy communist wars and the painful processes of decolonization then. A subsequent 1987 Amendment Protocol allowed for the accession of non-Southeast Asian states and thus extended its governance to external relations. It is a regional code of conduct for ASEAN member states, guiding constructive engagement and maintaining peace and stability in this region. It also plays an important role in facilitating cooperative relations in and beyond this region. Accession to the TAC is a precondition for engagement with ASEAN. Now, who signed it and what does it mean for ASEAN? All ASEAN member states and its dialogue partners are signatories to the TAC. This includes major powers such as the US, China, the EU, and some of the EU's member states such as France and Germany. There are now 43 signatories to the TAC, with the latest being Cuba, Colombia, and South Africa at the recent 37th ASEAN Summit. Accession to the TAC underscores countries' commitment and relationship to ASEAN and its emphasis on multilateral cooperation. The mid-1990s and early 2000s was a period of expansion with many countries acceding to the TAC, and this period also saw the establishment of the ASEAN Regional Forum in 1994 and the East Asia Summit in 2005. This helped to cement ASEAN's centrality in the regional architecture. The TAC indeed has the potential for broader application. During the 40th anniversary of the treaty in 2016, ASEAN foreign ministers agreed to explore a legally binding instrument building upon the TAC for the wider region. The reaffirmation of the treaty as a key code of conduct in regional architecture was also strengthened last year, with a commitment to further promoting its purposes and principles while welcoming new signatories. However, there is room for the treaty's conflict management and dispute resolution mechanisms to be enhanced, including in the utilization and empowerment of the High Council.
This special style is known as the ASEAN Way. ASEAN provided a set of rules of conduct. Always flexible and consensual, the ASEAN Way is a way and a mindset to manage diversity. Its procedural dimension is grounded in the use of informal rather than legalistic mechanisms to manage conflicts or to arrive at decisions. Informal and consensual means of dispute settlement in ASEAN are underpinned by conflict avoidance or containment. It comes from the spirit and practice of musyawarah, consultation, or mufakat, consensus, observed in Indonesian villages and, to some extent, in Malaysia and the Philippines. As a result of the ASEAN Way, informal diplomacy is a mark of the regional grouping. The building of trust and confidence among member states cannot be imposed by institutional constraints. Indeed, ASEAN set up specific rules and mechanisms to promote the inner logic of its founders. ASEAN became a venue for a very friendly form of diplomacy, also called sport shirt diplomacy, where issues considered too sensitive to tackle are dealt with either through quiet diplomacy or bilateral summitry. Consequently, the group is known largely for photos of its leaders locking arms at annual meetings in a show of unity despite thorny differences.
The ASEAN Way is a process in ASEAN which require all members to sit down, discuss, exchange view. Sometimes it takes a long time before they can make a decision. And the decision must be based on a consensus. Sometimes outside the political pundit will complain that it takes so long. But what is interesting has been that once the decision has been made, all ASEAN members will comply and follow suit without any argument. And one big advantage of this is that ASEAN seldom quarrel with one another after decision has been made, because it will make them look bad. So they often remain very united. So I hope that in the future, during the pandemic era or in the post-pandemic, ASEAN will continue to rely on ASEAN Way to set up priorities regarding the economic recovery and other regional issues.
It was an effort by the regional states to simply assure each other that they were no longer going to interfere in one another's affairs. Now, to make more sense of this, you have to understand that all of these countries, to differing degrees, were involved at the time in the process of state building. They were trying to make a coherent national identity out of many disparate communities, religions, language groups within their own borders. And at the same time, they were all also concerned with the threat of communist insurgency. And so by agreeing not to interfere in one another's affairs, they at least took each other off of the table as potential threats. So that's where ASEAN started. And then later on, it evolved into something more substantial. But nonetheless, that concern with protecting national sovereignty and agreeing not to interfere in one another's affairs in order to create that breathing room, that remains a significant preoccupation with the member states even today. So it's still a relevant concern.
It was only in 1976, during the Bali Summit, that the ASEAN Secretariat was established in Jakarta. Today, the ASEAN Secretariat headquarters, enlarged in 2019, welcomes some 400 bureaucrats, a small number that reflects the concern of not being dominated by an invasive, supranational structure. Its basic function is to provide for greater efficiency in the coordination of ASEAN organs and for more effective implementation of ASEAN projects and activities. It is currently working along four main departments: the ASEAN Political Security Community Department, the ASEAN Economic Community Department, the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community Department, and the Community and Corporate Affairs Department. ASEAN currently holds roughly 1,500 meetings a year.
For ASEAN bureaucrats, there are two groups. The first group, I would call them professional officers. They are openly recruited from nationals of all the 10 member states. So they apply and then they are interviewed and then they are selected on merit. And then the other group, we call them the local staff, the support staff. These are all Indonesian. So we have two groups. On top of this, we have the top executive. The top at the head of the ASEAN Secretariat is the Secretary General of ASEAN. The Secretary General of ASEAN is chosen on a rotation basis by alphabetical order. Now we have Dato Lim Chok Hoi from Brunei. and he has been serving since 2018. So 5 years term, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. So he'll finish his 5-year term at the end of 2022. After that, from B, Brunei, it will be C, Cambodia. I already mentioned to you that Prime Minister Hun Sen of Cambodia has a candidate in mind, and he is Dr. Khao Kim Hon. You may know him. So he'll come in by the year 2023 for another 5 years. And then after C, it will be I, Indonesia. So it's alphabetical order. And the Secretary General of ASEAN is appointed by the ASEAN Summit. ASEAN leaders appoint him for a one-term 5-year non-renewable. And then assisting him, there are 4 Deputy Secretary General. 2 of them are openly recruited. The Deputy for Economic Cooperation Department, the Deputy for ASEAN Corporate Affairs. These 2 are openly recruited, they advertise, and then applicants are interviewed by the permanent representative to ASEAN, the CPR in Jakarta. So it's a very competitive position. The Deputy Secretary General served 3 years term, renewable by another 3 years, but on competition basis. There'll be re-application and then new interview. So 2 of them. And then the other 2, Deputy Secretary General for ASCC, ASEAN Socio-Cultural Department, and the Deputy for ASEAN Political Security Department. These 2 are nominated by rotation also for 3 years, 1 term. So these are the makeup of our ASEAN Secretariat bureaucrat. And they are paid from the operating budget of the ASEAN Secretariat, to which each member state contributes equally. We base on equal contribution. That's a very big difference from the European Union. We don't have any assessment but equal contribution. So the problems always that ASEAN Secretariat budget is always determined by the member state that is least willing to pay. The poorest, usually the poorest, Myanmar or Laos, Cambodia, they will set the limit how many percentage of growth they can allow per year, usually less than 5%. So each year now, the operating budget of the ASEAN Secretariat is only about 20 million US dollar, to which each member government contribute only 2 millions. It's a really cost-effective operation to run an ASEAN Secretariat, because ASEAN Secretariat can draw in a lot of contribution from member states, from the European Union, from Japan, from Australia to fund projects in ASEAN. So it's a very, very good investment to have the ASEAN Secretariat.
Considered as a mechanism to promote peace, stability, and prosperity for every member state, ASEAN and the ASEAN Way succeeded. The association has brought peace and stability to the region, which in turn helped accelerate economic growth and social progress in Southeast Asia for the last 50 years. In a rather peaceful climate, with political stability, even if authoritarian stability, economic development was made possible. Because stability inspired confidence, foreign direct investment rushed into a crucial region, a hub of globalization. ASEAN became a major global hub of manufacturing and trade, as well as one of the fastest growing consumer markets in the world. From 1967 to 1997, the average growth rate of member states was around 7% per year, and GDP per capita increased 4.5%. ASEAN was associated with Southeast Asia's success story.
Is economics the primary objective of the ASEAN? Well, the response to this question is definitely no. The primary objective of establishing the Association of Southeast Asian Nations back in 1967 was a political objective. The point was to set aside the disputes, the disagreements that the countries in the region had at the time, be they territorial disputes or historical disputes, with one objective in mind: to help them strengthen their institutions. Of course, the pacification of the situation in the region certainly contributed to the economic development, or at least it laid the ground for this economic development, and the countries could focus on their economic development rather than on some other issues, political issues in the region. Over time, economic cooperation gained in importance among these ASEAN countries. But interestingly, economic cooperation was not so much, as in the case of Europe, about developing intra-regional linkages, intra-regional trade or intra-regional investment. It was more about making ASEAN an attractive location for production. And so the point was to attract, in particular, foreign direct investment into the region.
As mentioned earlier, ASEAN has allowed the creation of connectivity and exchange where little existed before 1967. The basic idea was to develop into a region which can stand on its own feet, strong enough to defend itself against any negative influence from outside the region. Indeed, the ASEAN cooperation framework has given enough confidence to each member state to consider a transformation of its own economy. Nevertheless, if for about 30 years, from 1967 to 1996, ASEAN's GDP grew at an average annual rate of 7.1%, a remarkable achievement since other developing countries grew at only about 3% during the same period, it still did not give strong impetus to intra-ASEAN cooperation, as intra-ASEAN trade did not exceed 23% of total trade for members. Today, that figure has increased to 27%. The lack of complementarity and the same schemes of development were the principal reasons for postponing effective modalities of intra-ASEAN economic cooperation. Different milestones shaped ASEAN economic cooperation. Among others, the Program of Action set up by the Bali Summit in 1976 established 3 instruments of ASEAN cooperation, namely the ASEAN Industrial Projects, the Preferential Trading Arrangements, and the ASEAN Industrial Cooperation Schemes, which would be complemented by the ASEAN Industrial Joint Ventures. The system of dialogues with the region's major partners, the US, Japan, Australia, the EU, was established at the Kuala Lumpur Summit in 1977. The Preferential Trading Arrangement and the ASEAN Industrial Joint Ventures were revitalized at the Manila Summit in 1987. Cooperation on tourism was augmented with the Visit ASEAN Year in 1992, and an ASEAN Free Trade Area and the ASEAN Industrial Cooperation Scheme encouraged and facilitated cooperation in many fields, from finance and banking to agriculture and fishing. Until 1997, ASEAN cooperation proved valuable for each member state, as a common medium for making the most of globalization. But as the 1997 financial crisis brutally demonstrated, ASEAN as a group was perceived as ineffective, unable to respond decisively, and trapped by the desires of its members to keep full control over their economic sovereignty. As such, ASEAN was facing a crucial contradiction. While promoting cooperation and exchange, it was not equipped with the tools and mechanisms to deal with the interactions it had produced. Amidst the deepening economic crisis, ASEAN leaders unveiled the ASEAN Vision 2020 in December 1997, and simultaneously held joint meetings with the leaders of China, Japan, and Korea in what would become the ASEAN Plus 3 grouping. The crisis, while stressing the importance of ASEAN mechanisms, gave rise to deeper East Asian economic cooperation, as highlighted by the eventual ASEAN Plus 1 free trade agreements and the Chiang Mai Initiative. In the following years, the ASEAN Vision was developed. The Hanoi Plan of Action of 1998 and the Bali Accord II of 2003 set out the establishment of the ASEAN Community by 2020, consisting of the ASEAN Security Community, eventually to be called the ASEAN Political Security Community, ASEAN Economic Community, the ASEAN, and the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community. Noting progress in implementing the action plans of the ASEAN Economic Community, or AEC, in a context of tighter competition for foreign investment from countries like China, the ASEAN leaders decided in 2007 to accelerate the realization of the AEC from 2020 to 2015. The AEC, established on December 31, 2015, was to move Southeast Asia toward a globally competitive single market and production base with a free flow of goods, services, labor, investment, and capital. On paper, ASEAN is a resilient, people-oriented region for its 662 million people. In reality, this is not yet the case, in part because of the immense disparity in terms of economic development, but also because of persisting economic nationalism. Indeed, if decisions are taken fast, their implementation remains ambiguous and painfully slow. Economic nationalism still undermines the integration process. For instance, discussions are still ongoing with regard to the ASEAN single window, which aims to reduce the time goods must wait at borders. If such an important aspect of the AEC has not been agreed on, it is because member states are still reluctant to harmonize their customs regimes with the same provisions, rules, and regulations at every border point within ASEAN. Furthermore, the AEC blueprint calls for the removal of non-tariff barriers, or NTBs, such as quotas and local content requirements. Yet of the 6,000 NTBs identified in ASEAN, few have been removed through the AEC process. Rather, the number of NTBs has continued to grow. The free flow of labor is limited to skilled labor, and ASEAN has not been able to produce streamlined product standards, reducing the incentive to produce for the ASEAN market, which does not exist as such. Last but not least, ASEAN's Enhanced Dispute Settlement Mechanism, or EDSM, is also vulnerable to political sensitivities.
What is the ASEAN Economic Community all about, and how has it been doing ever since 2015 when it was officially launched? The ASEAN Economic Community is the latest development in terms of economic cooperation within the region. It rests on 4 pillars. The 4th pillar was the creation of single market and production base, involving freedom of movements of goods, capital, labor, services, etc. In this respect, what we observe is progress in the freedom of movement of goods. A number of procedures have been streamlined at the border, for instance, and so the movement of goods is now almost totally free. Progress is not as obvious in other domains. In particular, the freedom of movement of labor is still limited to skilled labor. So the 4 freedoms of movement, as observed in the European Union, for instance, are certainly not guaranteed within ASEAN. The 2nd pillar was about the creation of a competitive economic region, which involved the harmonization of a number of policies such as competition policy, consumer protection, for instance. In this respect, this is probably where the ASEAN countries still have a lot to do. There are still wide divergences, wide differences among these various policies. The third pillar was the establishment of an equitable economic development, which involves in particular bridging the development gaps among the ASEAN countries. Here we still see a number of wide development gaps, but a lot of efforts are devoted to bridging these gaps. The fourth pillar was the integration into the global economy. The fourth pillar was the easiest goal to achieve, and what we see is that all ASEAN countries are quite actively participating in global value chains, for instance. So they are deeply integrated in the global economy. This is not really something that was very tricky to achieve. How will the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership impact the ASEAN Economic Community? The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership will have a very positive impact on the ASEAN Economic Community. First, the RCEP will help ASEAN countries trade with each other. So this is in line with the first pillar of the AEC, which is about a single market and a single production base. Secondly, the RCEP will also help and facilitate trade between ASEAN member countries and their 5 dialogue partners, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. And this is in line with the fourth pillar of the AEC, which is about connecting ASEAN with the rest of the global economy and pushing for the development of global supply chains. So this is perfectly in line with this integration objective of this AEC.
Interestingly, although security is not the focus of ASEAN, it is an absolute precondition to stability and development. And yes, considering the threatening atmosphere of the 1960s, one can assert that a security community has been set up in Southeast Asia, a community where no one will go to war to solve conflict within the region. The incremental way was adopted with the Declaration of Zopvan in 1971, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation in 1976, the Treaty of Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapons Free Zone in 1995, the Declaration on the South China Sea in 1992, and later, in 2002, the Declaration on the Code of Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. Nevertheless, after the Bali terrorist attack in 2002, which followed the September 11th attacks in the United States in 2001, ASEAN leaders resolved to establish an ASEAN security community at their 9th summit in Bali in October 2003 to increase Southeast Asian strategic autonomy and resilience, to resist domestic and transnational threats, to protect against external competition, and to avoid being trapped into great power rivalry. The community is made up of a growing web of socialization where security issues are addressed not only within the association, for instance, through the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, or ADMM, the ASEAN Plan of Action to Combat Transnational Crime, the meeting of ASEAN Chiefs of Police, or that of ASEAN Army Chiefs, but also with external partners, through the ASEAN Regional Forum, which was established in 1994 and is now composed of 27 members, or the ADMM+. Yet, can the association really pretend to act as an efficient contributor to security? If it has proven to be an efficient meeting hub to discuss security issues, it is not yet so when dealing with more hardcore issues. Until now, and after nearly 20 years, ASEAN and its member states have yet to sign the final Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, and tensions are recurrent. On plenty of other issues, the bi- or trilateral level is favored.
Well, it's very natural and very important because ASEAN countries are either weak or small states. There is, of course, in terms of size, we have fairly big states like Indonesia, but none of the ASEAN states are a great power. And there are a lot of smaller countries in ASEAN in terms of economic size, like Singapore and Brunei, but also in terms of material power, in terms of economic capacity. You have a lot of very poor countries. So all these countries can do well if they are together, and none of them can really do as well if they go unilateral. Perhaps Indonesia can do it. Perhaps maybe Singapore can do it with because it has all the resources. But diplomatically speaking, ASEAN countries do better collectively at the international stage than going by themselves, going it alone. Yeah. And I think this has been a major rationale for ASEAN from the beginning when it was created in 1967. And small states, for weak states, or for weaker powers, regional cooperation is a great springboard for diplomacy at the global or international level. And that I don't think has changed. I don't think any country has moved out of ASEAN or thought about seriously leaving ASEAN, partly because they think they're better off with ASEAN as a collective grouping than going it alone. I will tell you what I mean by a security community. I think the bottom line of a security community is to avoid outbreak of war or outright war among the member states. That's the minimal condition of a security community. So there will be conflicts, disputes, but those disputes and conflicts will not be resolved by going to war or using force. And that's going by that definition. I think ASEAN has done very well. It's not a question of being efficient or reliable, but it's the record that you can see that as member countries of ASEAN, no ASEAN member has fought a war against another ASEAN member. Beyond a minor conflict, you can talk about Thailand and Cambodia over the pre-Bihar temple. But most of the wars in Southeast Asia have been fought when among countries, at least some of them are not ASEAN members. So you can talk about Vietnam and Cambodia, a conflict with, earlier conflict with Thailand. You can talk about Malaysia and Indonesia, that was before ASEAN, or Thailand's conflicts with Burma, Laos. All these happened when at least one party was not an ASEAN member. So I think that record speaks for itself. It's unless one is blindsided and ignores the empirical reality, ASEAN has done very well. But then if you expand the definition of security community to include other things like military competition, or what some people call arms race, or a diplomatic bickering, kind of using harsh language against each other, and there ASEAN has not done as well. Although military competition and arms race in ASEAN is overstated. But certainly there has been disputes, conflicts, there has been lack of unity on issues like South China Sea, for example. And there has been also a lack of concerted action at the global level to address issues such as, ASEAN has no peacekeeping force. There has been, lack of unity on some issues like environmental protection and for example, the dealing with the forest fires, which happen quite regularly between Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the like. On those issues, there could have been more cooperation. But to me, that happens everywhere. That happens in the European Union, in fact, much more so these days than before. And I don't think that detracts from the minimal condition of a security community, which is still very significant, because ASEAN countries could have gone to war with each other or could have escalated their conflicts. Singapore, Malaysia is a classic example. There was always some threat of conflicts. Thailand and Cambodia, Thailand and Myanmar, but they have stepped back. And to me, that is very significant. But if you expand the definition of security community to include military competition, of not having military competition, or having a united front on everything, on environmental destruction, or degradation, or dealing with the South China conflict with China, if you want to include that, then ASEAN, of course, could do a lot more. But I don't think that's really integral to being a security community. I think that's a mature security community. ASEAN is not a mature security community. It's more like a element, what you call nascent. I have used the term nascent, borrowing from theoretical work of Adler and Barnett. And I think ASEAN still remains a nascent security community.
The socio-cultural pillar of the community is probably the least accomplished in the emergence of a common ASEAN identity. Here, once again, it is difficult to distinguish what emanates from ASEAN and from ASEAN member states, as, for instance, the Southeast Asian Games. The ASEAN Foundation, as an ASEAN body, has been instrumental in building this sense of identity through its various culture and heritage projects, but with mixed results. In 2019, only 27% of Southeast Asians feel familiar with ASEAN. There appears to be limited public awareness of why ASEAN matters, how it operates, and what role it plays. The association somehow fails to generate interest. Instead, it appears to be an elite construct for many, something deeply familiar to the bureaucrats and a segment of professionals who regularly travel around the region for meetings, yet seemingly distant to most of its people.
So I identify myself as a Southeast Asian, but not necessarily ASEAN. I was born and raised in Indonesia, and I did spend a bit of time in Singapore as well, and I'm currently based in Thailand, in Bangkok. Culturally, I feel related with one other states because I do get to travel a lot within the region. So I always feel at home wherever I travel in the region because people always talk to me the local language, and that's why I feel at home. But all in all, ASEAN does not really bring much change in my daily life, other than the fact that this is just an institution that represents the region that I'm coming from.
Indeed, ASEAN identity markers have largely been institutional and confined to bureaucratic circles, having an ASEAN flag or an anthem, for instance, instead of seeping into the public popular sphere. For the time being, ASEAN has not been able to reach a consensus on adopting a common ASEAN logo on the region's different national passports, even though the topic has been under discussion for the last decade as a tangible sign of having become the long-awaited ASEAN community. The goals of the ASEAN socio-cultural community are achieved through cooperation in the areas of tourism, including visa-free and open skies agreements, education, sports, culture and arts, information, labor, youth, women, civil service, and science and technology. Plans are worked out for region-wide cooperation and implementation in the areas of social welfare, health, including pandemic diseases, disaster management, transboundary air pollution, the environment and climate change, rural development, and poverty eradication. 2020 has been designated as the year of the ASEAN identity, but the crucial challenge now is to empower ASEAN civil society to concretely transform the association into a community of opportunities for all Southeast Asians. Now in its 50s, and despite its notable track record, ASEAN is facing many challenges. Among them, 4 have been selected. First, geopolitical stability and regional coherence. It is difficult for ASEAN, located at a strategically important junction, to deter the ambitions of global powers and to preserve ASEAN's freedom, neutrality, and centrality. Southeast Asia is entering a period of unprecedented uncertainty in the global strategic order, and if the souring U.S.-China competition persists or worsens, ASEAN will be crucial in preserving the region's peace and security. Furthermore, some ASEAN member states are also enmeshed in territorial disputes with interested powers. China's claim to territories in the South China Sea, for example, overlaps with competing claims with Brunei Darussalam, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. The ongoing negotiations on a code of conduct illustrate the difficulty for ASEAN nation-states to go beyond their comfort level to forge unity and solidarity among themselves. Second, institutional resilience. As technical issues are more and more complex, as interdependencies are stronger, and cooperation more useful than ever, ASEAN mechanisms might prove insufficient. Yet, could ASEAN change its mechanisms without impinging on its famous ASEAN way? In some instances, this may even mean having to utilize consensus-based mechanisms differently than in the past, and invoking international legal mechanisms when negotiations falter. On August 8, 2019, as ASEAN turned 52 years old, it marked the occasion with the opening of the new ASEAN Secretariat building in Jakarta to house member representatives and Secretariat staff. But will the new building be a source of dynamism to revisit rules and mechanisms? Or just another layer in the bureaucratic maze? Third, governance challenges for businesses. ASEAN, home to a wide variety of businesses, from huge family-owned conglomerates and state-linked enterprises to small and medium-sized enterprises, should enable better governance practices to prevent corruption and help the region compete globally. And fourth, creating a link between the youth and ASEAN. ASEAN is home to young, literate, increasingly urbanized and aspirational populations. But do they really identify with ASEAN and build connections among them? Do they perceive ASEAN as an instrument of the past, comforting the status quo, or as a vector to build their future? In a context of resurging identity and religious politics in many parts of Southeast Asia, will ASEAN defend its vision as an open, inclusive, and future-oriented regional space, as defined in the ASEAN Community Vision 2025? ASEAN's aim of being truly people-oriented and people-centered remains one of the mega-challenges, especially for the younger generation. The urgency of ensuring the relevance of ASEAN's actions for its people therefore remains the most urgent challenge.
What are ASEAN's main challenges? I think the main challenge is to deal with a rising China. Because China is so big, so powerful, both economically and militarily, that ASEAN can only deal with China by being united and not being divided. And maintaining that unity has proven to be very, very difficult and will continue to be difficult, especially when China has, especially in dealing with conflicts like the South China Sea conflict, which involves several ASEAN countries. And also avoiding a Chinese economic sphere of influence, becoming too dependent on China, avoiding that. That is ASEAN's main challenge. Another related challenge is how to deal with the US. And in that context, you can talk about US-China rivalry, how to carve out a niche, a position of not siding with either country, either power, but maintaining its autonomy, neutrality, or what we call the ASEAN centrality is a very big challenge. In terms of a few other challenges, I think maintaining economic growth in the face of this severe economic impact of the pandemic, COVID-19, that will be a big challenge for the next several years, if not decades. Also, avoiding internal problems. I think the populism or authoritarianism, trends towards authoritarianism, which is happening everywhere in the world, but ASEAN is also going through that, how to maintain democracy, human rights to the best possible extent, and how to protect people and protect minorities. These are going to be major challenges, of course, for ASEAN. And climate change, environmental degradation, ASEAN is a big victim of environmental degradation, deforestation, climate change, rise of sea levels, how to provide a credible response to climate change, where ASEAN's response is very mixed. I think that's also going to be a major challenge.
Yeah.
In terms of trends, if you see trends, I think the major trends is going to be, sometimes reflecting the global trend. So we have a rise of transnational challenges. We have pandemic is going to be with us for looks like for some time, and how to avoid more deaths and infections. Another trend will be again the rise of China and U.S.-China rivalry. How do you that's going to continue? And finally, again, I want to go back to climate change. I think that's going to environmental degradation is going to continue, and that is going to put ASEAN under a lot of challenge and pressure.
Okay, and ASEAN Men success for you, the added value of the association?
Yeah. I think I already mentioned that. I think ASEAN's major success is avoiding a major conflict, meaning major military confrontation among its members. And I think that is the most remarkable achievement. Second achievement would be to be able to engage all the major powers of the world, whether it's US, China, or Russia, or India, or the European Union, engaging them and creating some sort of a platform for them to come to Southeast Asia and talk to not only Southeast Asian ASEAN members, but to each other in a way that makes everybody comfortable. That's a real major achievement for ASEAN. And also, I think one cannot build a direct causal link between ASEAN cooperation and economic growth in the region, but having a relatively, and I emphasize relatively stable regional environment has allowed countries, ASEAN member countries, to focus on economic growth and provide some sort of political stability. And again, that's one should not overstate that. But I think if you didn't have an ASEAN and you didn't have an atmosphere of a relative stability, I think it is an open question whether Southeast Asia could have achieved that much economic growth that it has for the past several decades.